Yes, I think it's obviously that carbon reduction is a really challenging globally, and you can say that it's being talked a lot about, but we need action for sure, and the cities has to take the action because 50% of the population is living in the city, so they have really the chance to do something about it. So it's giving attention, but we require actions. I think there's also some other, you could say, urgent issues. I think resources, the use of resources is also a big challenge. We're using simply too much resources to be sustainable. So we're using maybe 2 times the resources we have globally. So we should reduce that. So circularity, we need to think about that. That is not being taking no action on that. A third item I would think of is biodiversity. So the land use, take up land for plants and species, so it's already a big crisis. So biodiversity and ecosystems, we have to do more about that. We have to give place for the species and the flora to flourish. And then I think the fourth item would be we have to make resilient cities. And when I say resilience, it's of course to adapt to the climate change that will eventually come, but it's also about social resiliencies in the cities. There's too much inequality, so we have to think about that. So this is the 4 main topics we have to look to. Yes, I think when we think about this solution, we have to think as in system thinking. It's all combined, so we can't solve one issue alone in isolation. We have to say that the infrastructure, the energy system, the building is one system. We have to solve it in combination. So holistic thinking and system thinking is vital. All systems are dependent of each other, so we have to solve it together. So when we solve, for example, adapt to a flooding issue, we can also at the same time make a livable place. So I think it's key to look at it in the system way. When we define regenerative design, we overall define it as we do something where we give something back to the site where we do the design. And we cannot look at the building in isolation. We have to see it, with the surroundings. So the energy system, the infrastructure around it to make it truly regenerative. But of course, on the building itself, we have to look at the four areas I defined before. So we have to look at the carbon. So we have to reduce the carbon, embodied carbon in the building as much as possible by using materials that is not so carbon intensive. We also have to look at operational carbon. So that's the one area. And then we have to look at biodiversity. So how can we have a building that takes up some space? How can we still? So we have to, we of course have to look at the carbon part. So the embodied carbon, how can we reduce the carbon as much as possible in the building? And how can we also reduce the operational carbon? So that's one thing. On biodiversity, we also have to look at that. So how can the site will take up some space where there could have been, flora or species. How can we replace that somewhere else in the area? Then we also have to look at the resources. So if you can renovate a building instead of knocking it down, we of course save a lot of resources and embodied carbon. So can we do that? Or can we reuse material from another site to make this new building? Maybe we have any way to try to save resources as much as possible. And the fourth item is of course to look at the building as part of a community and make sure that the social part is also benefiting from this building. So it could be affordable housing we have to look into. I know Singapore is very much looking at that, and I think all cities have to look at that. So we get a city that is for everybody. So if you're talking about the carbon part, I think one of the challenges we have actually is to get transparency about data. So when we do a calculation for embodied carbon in a building, we need to have data for all the materials we put into the building, and we don't have that today. So for example, how much CO2 is produced for making a window, we don't know. So it's very difficult to make these carbon calculations. So we need the industry to be transparent around how much CO2 do they use to make the different materials. Then you can do the calculation, and then you can start regulate it and try to minimize the CO2. So transparency of data is very important. So digitalization and transparency of data is important. I think it's important that the authority, they also put requirement on maximum limit of carbon in the buildings, both on embodied carbon and operational carbon. I don't think the market itself can regulate the carbon input. We have to regulate it, and we have to give maximum values. So in Denmark, where I'm from, it will from 1st of January 2023, all new buildings has to meet certain requirements for embodied carbon and for operational carbon. So that will, then the different developers, they have to compete on equal levels. And that will drive the development. The first requirement will be easy to meet, I believe, but we will still have to do the calculation, and then gradually over the next 5 years, the limit will go down. And that's the way to do it, I believe. So the different private sectors, they compete on even ground.